Thank you, Lisa, and thank you all for being here. It's wonderful to see your faces. I wish we could be in person. I'm going to be more rabbi than doctor today, because as I've been speaking with folks over the last number of weeks and months, some are acclimating to our new realities, but we're also growing weary. So I want to begin with a story. It's an old Yiddish folk tale that may be familiar to many of you because there was a children's book adaptation. It's about a poor family living together in a teeny tiny home, a mother, a father, a grandmother, half a dozen kids. They were always on top of each other, occasionally short-tempered with each other, and feeling a bit trapped, especially when circumstances prevented them from being outside. So finally, the parents decided to go to the rabbi for advice. I think they set up a Zoom call. I think I can help, said the rabbi, but you have to follow my instructions, even if they don't make sense to you. So the couple agreed, and the rabbi said, you have a goat, right? Bring the goat into the house. But rabbi, even though it doesn't make sense, bring the goat into the house. So the next week they were back. It's worse now. The goat smells and poops in the house and gets in the garbage and strews it all about. Well, said the rabbi, I understand. So bring your chickens in too. So reluctantly, that's what they did. And you can imagine the clucking, the feathers, always underfoot. Plus, they didn't get along so well with the goat. It was even worse. So the couple returned to the rabbi. The only thing to do, said the rabbi, is to bring your cow in as well. So they did. Now there was barely room to move. Cows are big. It was unbearable. So this time when the couple returned to the rabbi, they were almost resigned. It was going to get even worse. Instead, the rabbi said, bring all your animals back outside now. Eagerly, they did that, and it was amazing how spacious the home now seemed. And they began to dance. So this afternoon, I want to reflect with you about resilience. Sometimes people assume that resilience is simply the ability to endure suffering or to bounce back after trauma or disruption. In fact, resilience is about the strength and speed with which we adapt to adversity. So I assume it's obvious why this is on my mind, but I don't want to think only about COVID-19. In fact, one important exercise in resilience is not to think only about what's afflicting you. Other ingredients of resilience aren't very surprising: flexibility, courage, support, a sense of purpose. But some of the tools are surprising. One is to be able to imagine what would be worse, like in the story, not so that it terrifies us, but rather because it didn't happen. And it can make the exercise of counting our blessings move from our head to deep in our hearts. In option B, the author, Sheryl Sandberg, writes about her husband's sudden death from a heart attack, and she can't imagine what could be worse. Her psychologist friend says, without missing a beat, what if he had the attack while driving your kids in the car? And she has this rush of overwhelming gratitude for the very life and breath of her children. Spirituality is also a source of resilience. It doesn't have to be religion per se, but our religious traditions provide teachings that foster spiritual resilience. Number one, we are loved. Though not without the high expectations that accompany intimacy, we are loved eternally and unconditionally. Ahava rabba avtanu, Jews recite in daily prayer. With a great love, you envelop us, O God. There's hope. Blessed is the one who helps the darkness to pass and reveals the light. Religion helps us imagine a world that's different than the one that is, and how we can help it take shape. We also cultivate gratitude. 100 blessings a day is what the rabbis advise, to recognize the goodness of the world that's present in every moment. Take nothing for granted. Blessing that I woke up this morning. Blessing that I can see. Blessing that creation is renewed. blessing that you are here. And we tell sacred stories of resilience. Since I'm a text person, this is where I'd like to tarry, on our sacred stories. One such story is found in the book of Ruth, an exercise in imaginative storytelling that comes to teach deeper truths than would be possible if it were history. So Naomi, her husband Elimelech, and their 2 sons, right? They experience famine in the land of Israel, and they adapt by moving to Moab. They settle there, and all seems well enough until Elimelech dies. Naomi's sons marry, and life seems to be bouncing back, but the sons are named sickness and consumptive if you translate them to English. And so you can guess that this new normal might be short-lived. And sure enough, Naomi's sons die too. And all this happens in the first 5 verses. So in the wake of this cascade of trauma, Naomi falls into many of the normal human behaviors that can stunt recovery. The 3 Ps is what psychologist Martin Seligman calls them. She personalizes it. It's somehow her fault, she concludes, and presumes that God's hand is striking out against her. Number 2, she assumes it's permanent. She'll feel this way forever. When she decides to go back to Bethlehem and her daughters-in-law offer to return with her, she puts them off, arguing that there is no hope for her future. Personalization, permanence, pervasiveness, everything in her life is horrible. She's kind of oblivious to Ruth's stunning declaration of fidelity, and when the women of Bethlehem greet her upon her return, she says, "How can you call me Naomi," which means pleasantness? "Call me Mara," bitterness, because I went away full, which of course romanticizes how good it was in the past since they left amidst a famine, but at least they had their family intact. "And I've come back empty," she says. Empty. Naomi has no capacity at that point to see the restorative power of Ruth by her side. We all have a psychological immune system. It looks for meaning in our experience, prepares us to endure, focuses our attention inward. It's essential for survival. But trauma can send our psychological immune system into overdrive, and it malfunctions. Still, Naomi moves beyond these limitations, helped in large part by other human beings acting with decency and kindness. Chesed, a loving kindness that doesn't expect reciprocity, that may not even be deserved, except that you're a creature in need. Chesed is transformative. Naomi is able to adapt to her new reality because Ruth and Boaz help her do it. Eventually, she can see past her own suffering and work toward Ruth's welfare as well, which is a vital marker in the healing process. It's important to note that Ruth and Naomi's resilience and recovery are also enabled by the law of the land. Adversity is not evenly distributed. Personal courage and interpersonal kindness aren't enough. The laws of gleaning ensure that Ruth and Naomi have enough to eat. The laws of redemption for persons and property enable them to rebuild their lives, even though they fell on hard times. This is why we fight for restorative and distributive justice in our legal systems. As Omar Usman writes, teaching people that they can overcome any situation by merely working hard enough is not only unrealistic, but utterly devoid of compassion. The notion that people can overcome structural inequality with grit or that charity will suffice is stupid and heartless. Thus, we're not really seeking closure for a resilient return to the status quo, but rather ongoing disclosure of how to foster change. Job is another story of resilience. One that wrestles with how to have faith in a world where God allows suffering. It's another non-historical tale that comes to teach something more. People sometimes talk about the patience of Job, but I think they haven't actually read that book. There are multiple chapters in which he lays out his theological complaint. He's not that patient. In fact, the 42 chapters of the book of Job versus the 4 chapters of the book of Ruth make me want to remark, to snark, that when adversity strikes, men want to go on a great length about their woes and women just deal with it. But in fact, they're different books with different approaches, and they both model resilience. The reality of suffering is a noble truth in Buddhist tradition. Jewish tradition recognizes the inevitability of suffering as a part of life, but struggles with it more. The book of Job brings together a variety of characters with different opinions about how to understand suffering. Most of Job's friends assume it's punishment for some kind of sin. Elihu imagines it can be an instructive tool for refining human character. Job argues that in the face of real suffering, these explanations are all inadequate and demands that God answer for the apparent injustice of it all. And God does. God's response is profoundly ambiguous, but the best reading of it, in my opinion, actually aligns with another tool of resilience, perspective. Amit Ravital, a clinical psychologist, comments, what we call good and bad are bound up together in a fractalized, multidimensional mosaic of cause and effect, so complex that only a God's eye view of it can see the full, holy order of it. And she's not talking about the book of Job, but it fits. God challenges Job's presumption that his perspective is sufficient and challenges his power to balance the forces of creation. So Ravital, in talking about perspective, gives the mundane example of recognizing the blessing of rain, even if it spoils your picnic. I think instead about this virus. Is it possible to honor the complexity of creation in which uncountable species compete for space and survival, including the tiniest ones, who can sometimes take down the mightiest among us? Like Job, can we find any comfort in our vulnerability from the fact that we are but dust and ashes? What can we learn from this virus besides how to kill it? Perhaps it's an instructive metaphor for humanity's existence on Earth. We move along for some time without noticeably harming our planet host, but then we make it sick. And if we don't evolve to become less deadly to it, we will have no host. There's another voice in the book of Job, one that often gets ignored or written off as demonic or simply a foil for the action, Hasatan, the adversary. This is not Satan or a fallen angel or any other associations that you might have. This is a figure in the service of God who's concerned that true faith must be resilient. If Job loves God only because everything's going well, what value does it have? It makes me think about a story of Philip Gulley, a Quaker minister, that he used to tell. He had a neighbor growing up who had a lot of land, who wanted to build a forest. And each year he'd go and he'd plant a bunch of trees, but he wouldn't water them. Instead, he'd go out and give them a modest whack every now and then with his morning newspaper. He said he did it to get their attention. And why didn't he water them? He wanted them to grow deep roots. Gulley thought about this story when he'd tuck his kids in and pray that no harm would ever come to them. But everyone encounters hardship, he realized. And eventually he changed his prayer. He prayed for his children's roots to grow deep, reaching deep into the reservoir of the eternal, so that when rains fall and the winds blow, they won't be swept asunder. He prayed for resilience. That's most of what I want to share. So we are going to do this something a little different this week. There is great comfort in seeing all of your faces, but it's hard to have a conversation with over 100 people. So in a moment, as Roxy's preparing this, we're going to be magically transported into breakout rooms of 4 or 5 people to talk for 10 minutes about resilience. If there are questions or comments you want to direct to me, you can send me an email. So we invite you to discuss one or more of these questions. I couldn't narrow them down or simplify them. Those of you who've been in my classes know why. That's just one of my weaknesses. So you won't be able to talk about all of them. One possibility is, have any of the 3 Ps ever shown up in your life? Misperceptions about adversity that lead to experiences of personalization, permanence, or pervasiveness? Or more simply, do you have a story of resilience you could share with your group? Or what within your experience and or spiritual life stance effectively nurtures resilience? And how are these strategies working for you in this current crisis? So those are some of the possibilities. And then you'll get a message in your room in about 60 seconds before we're going to come back together so that you can finish your thoughts. And then we'll magically flow back into the main room. There won't be time for reporting back, so this conversation is just for your group. Then I'll share a closing thought when we come back together. So thanks so much.